Welcome to the second of our two summer events featuring alumni and faculty of Under the Volcano. Before we jump into tonight's conversation, I just want to say a few words by way of background for those tuning in who may not know even what Under the Volcano is. And then, of course, the usual very short litany of housekeeping procedures so you all know what to expect. Um, Under the Volcano is a program of writing masterclasses for poets, fiction writers, essayists, and journalists, which is the focus of tonight's evening, that's been meeting in the village of Tepoztlan, Mexico for the past 17 years every January as an intensive residency for writers from across Latin America, primarily Mexico, since we're in Mexico, and the English speaking world, primarily the United States, since it's so close. We'll say nothing further about that at the moment. We'll sure come to it. Canada, often the UK, and other countries in which writers are using English as their primary language, even if not native. And these workshops, these master classes, have brought together groups of fairly advanced or, if emerging, very talented writers and journalists generally in mid career to spend up to 3 weeks together in generative and productive constellations of workshops and also public events and conversations. And the idea of taking these conversations home has arisen from our desire to literally move out from our village and become connected to audiences from wherever our participants come, so they are, in a way, our ambassadors. Tonight's evening is featuring TYRONE BEASON, a senior reporter at the Los Angeles Times, who only recently parachuted there from Seattle. So one of the things we're going to do is kind of start off with a mapping of where he came from, where he's now, where this all may be going. And before we come to that, just to keep you in a tiny bit of suspense, let me backtrack and say a couple more things about Under the Volcano. We are running the series all summer while we're beginning to read applications for next year's program in January of 2021. I don't think it's going to be news to any of you that we are in the middle of the greatest crisis of most of our lifetimes, the pandemic or pandemia, as it's known in Spanish. And for that reason, we're going to be creating a unique and, we hope, exciting, we hope, inspiring, we hope, even reassuring cyber residency. We're going into the sky. We're going to be in and out of Zoom and using other platforms to bring more writers together than actually we ever could when we needed to have people flying into Mexico or riding buses from one part of Mexico to another. We're now opening this out literally into a virtual world, and we're very excited about it. So I hope, if you haven't already, that you'll go to our website, which is, of course, underthevolcano.org. I emphasize org because that signifies that it's a nonprofit, and we are an organization whose mission is to identify and support talented writers regardless of their ability to cover our tuition. So we basically offer financial aid to half of the participants, and we also have several full fellowships for those with very unusual degree of promise. And I refer you again to the webpage. We'll later post some links if you're able to support us with donations of any amount to our scholarship fund. That will be incredibly appreciated for next year's session. Housekeeping, okay? We're on Facebook Live, it's streaming, there's a chat. We really are eager for your questions. So if you're out there and you're watching and you hear something that TYRONE BEASON has to say and you would like to ask him a question of your own, we have allocated the last quarter hour of this hour event for your questions. They need to come to us as texts. It won't be live. We won't be able to see you, alas, but we certainly look forward to seeing what's on your mind, and we'll do our best to include the questions that come to us if they do. And so this is, again, to encourage you, please, if you're out there and you want to know something, you want to contribute to the conversation, we're here to listen to those questions, to receive them, and they'll be read out aloud in so much as we get them. Sometimes people in our audiences seem to be very cyber shy, but we hope you won't be. Um, I think that's kind of all I need to say here at the outset. And if I've missed anything, I'll catch up to myself as we go along. Because I really want you to have the benefit of the most possible time interacting with Tyrone Beason. So I started out by telling you that all of the featured presenters this summer are alumni or faculty of the program. Now, Tyrone came to Under the Volcano in Tepoztlan in 2017, I think, or maybe it was 2016. He'll correct me. But he is not an alumnus who learned to be a journalist in 2 weeks in Mexico. Very few people could do that. He came to us as already a seasoned reporter based in Seattle, Washington, at the Seattle Times, where he worked for 20 years. And only just last fall made the move to the LA Times to join their team covering the United States presidential campaign, which has become an unraveling and a story unto itself in ways, of course, no one could have then anticipated. But when I asked Tyrone when he was applying to the program, why would you be doing this at this stage in your career? He was already an experienced journalist with hundreds of articles, I assume, under his belt. It had to do with wanting to move outside his beat and also curiosity about a side of the communities he was covering in Seattle that he felt he didn't know. And so I think this is always a fascinating characteristic of journalists in general, is the curiosity and the sense that, yes, I can do this, but there's other things that I don't know, and I want to explore that. I want to go to the outer edges. So I will ask Tyrone some questions that will maybe help us move around that landscape of knowing and not knowing, and how you find things out. Who are your sources? How do you do this job? Um, Basically, when he and I were talking in advance of this event, what we thought about was, because he's moved around a lot, because he was born in the US South, to sort of roam the map of the United States in a conversation that would look at, for his own trajectory, but also in a sense, it maps out in some ways over the trajectory of the country. It seems to me, um, in terms of changing beats, literally changing geographies, and tapping into what I'm calling the beat of change, um, as the pandemic has come to intersect so recently and so profoundly, shockingly, and acutely with matters of race, exactly in the lead up to the US presidential campaign. So that's kind of by way of setting the stage, creating a context as we jump into a conversation between now friends. And Tyrone has been back to Mexico a number of times, and so I feel the connection is very real and really kind of important to the program, and moving too, because he didn't have to come back. And so I think it's a connection to the country and to maybe the place Tepoztlan. I'd like to think that that has had some impact on you. So I wonder if we could just go back, sort of to the beginning, origins, since we're taking the map as a metaphor. Tyrone, would you like to, just kind of say where you grew up? When did you think you might become a journalist? Was it a long held dream of 10-year-old Tyrone, or was it an epiphany in college? How did you get to set out on that path?
Well, thanks very much, and hello to everybody who's joining today. And of course, I have to come back. I mean, my heart, part of my heart is in Tepoztlan and with the whole community of Under the Volcano. So it's my pleasure and privilege to come back. But I grew up in Kentucky. I'm a child of the post-civil rights movement, so I didn't get to experience, any of the hope and frustration that came with that movement and with the progress, and few steps forward, several steps back, sort of experience of people who went through that decade. I was born in 1972, so I was a different sort of Black child, actually. I didn't experience segregated schools. I didn't have to go to drink at colored water fountains, but the South, as I've written on a number of occasions, was born in me even, and that sort of Jim Crow experience was born in me. So I take it with me wherever I go. But, you know, I grew up in Bowling Green, Kentucky, a little college town. Spent a lot of time on the farm, helping my granddad raise tobacco and going fishing in the afternoons. I mean, it was a very sort of a, you know, old school kind of upbringing. I was not an urban child either, so I'm kind of a country boy. I mean, I still think of myself that way. But my view on the world was very much influenced by that. My parents did actually have those experiences, which they sort of told to me in sort of fits and starts over my childhood. And so I had a sense of what came before. But I think this whole generation of African Americans, sort of in their 40s and 50s, you know, they grew up in a very different America than the one that their parents and grandparents knew. So I was equipped with that knowledge, which was passed right down to me in my household. But also, what was born in me was a whole other sense of possibility about what it was to be Black and Indian and to live in the United States and to control one's destiny. And so I really took that to heart. You know, the readings of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X were so important to me, among others, when I was a kid growing up. And when I was exposed to the lessons that they had, and I don't think that they're competing, actually. I think they both were tapping into the same kind of African American frustration. They might have had different ways of, you know, talking about it and looking for change, but both of those figures, along with everyone else I was reading at the time, really got me thinking about what it was to be an American at a very, very early age. I didn't know that I was going to be a journalist or that I wanted to be a journalist, but by my teenage years, I discovered that writing was going to be because I was kind of a shy kid, my way of expressing whatever it was that was going on inside of me. And, you know, I have to say that, you know, my identity has played a lot, played a huge role in how I've thought about myself and what I should do with my life. And I don't know if that's common or not, but for me it was. You know, I think writing is always an exploration of the self as much as it is the subject at hand. And so I was using writing really to explore those things that I was curious about, and also to kind of work out what it was to be Black in the United States. I mean, maybe I didn't know how to articulate it that way when I was a kid, but that's clearly where I was headed. So college majored in journalism, and you know, the rest is history.
So you did major in journalism.
Yeah. I knew what I wanted to do. By the time I reached the age of 15 or 16, writing for my high school paper, I knew. Yeah,
So we say you're a born journalist, maybe.
almost. Yeah, but I think that, you know, I think sometimes, I don't know, I'm a very mystical person. I feel like a lot of things are born in me. And then I didn't know that I was going to be a writer. I wanted to be an artist and an astronomer. I mean, all kinds of things. But the fact that I settled on something that would allow me to use that inner conversation in a way that allowed other people to understand better what it was to be in the world, whether it's their community, their country, or the world at large. I mean, the use of language in order to help, in order to work out that sense of that existential question, right? Why am I here? That I think came before I knew that I wanted to be a writer.
So there's this inner impulse. I'm
Yeah.
curious about another aspect of that. I mean, so you go to journalism school. Um, I know the training traditionally is about developing a kind of a neutral stance, a neutral voice, right? Being able to
Yeah.
cover just about anything that's thrown at you. Could you say something, talk about just the whole idea of how your own voice emerges and how you get a sense of what are the stories? I mean, I'm sure you're versatile and you could do it all, right? You have to go up through the ranks and cover crime and
Mhm.
cover everything that there is, you know, the little stories and the bigger stories and the bigger stories. But how do you move from um, you know, what you're describing, this kind of search for identity through the professional expectations and come out being Tyrone Beason, who is doing these major exploratory features that are very challenging. I mean, what you're writing now is it's not everyday journalism.
Right. It's not, and I actually I wish it were, but it needs to be. But and I shouldn't be one of only a few people who do this as a kind of specialty. Although there's a lot of talented folks who write about race and identity in the country, I feel like it's still an emerging field of journalism, and we'll talk about that, some of the reasons for that later. But as a kid, of course, and as a young journalist, I did everything, right. One of my first stories was actually covering a campaign speech on behalf of George H.W. Bush when he was running for president, by President Ronald Reagan. And you know, you talk about identity. I mean, I'm this skinny black kid in an arena, I don't know, 12, 13,000 people, and all white. And I'm there to cover it for my high school paper, basically. And it's one of those moments where you kind of realize who you are, where the world makes you realize who you are. And it got me thinking a little bit about how to be who I am and be in a setting like that is so unlike me and so unlike my world. And so I had those experiences very early on. First time I ever went to Washington, D.C., also in the sort of late 80s. um, it's also the first time I ever saw homeless people living on park benches or what have you. It was on the National Mall. And my personal outrage about that really helped to seal the deal when it came to being a journalist. That sense of outrage and sense of, something's not right here. Um, that really made me want to be a journalist. So it wasn't some impulse, born out of a need to this dream of writing perfectly balanced, objective stories. I didn't care at all about that. I wanted to use my voice to actually shed light on the human experience. And I didn't think that there was anything objective about that then, and I don't think there is now. I do this for a reason. I do it with a sense of purpose, and I try not to hide that. I think the benefit of being a senior journalist is that I don't have to as much, right? I mean, I can take on sort of heady topics and complicated issues and not run away from the my own sense of injustice and outrage about it. When you're younger, you're right, you're covering all kinds of stories, and you really need to be flexible enough to get out there and do that and learn the ropes. But even with experiences like that, like with Reagan, or I interviewed Rosa Parks when I was an intern in the mid '90s at the Seattle Times, and you know that was just a daily story, right? Something you're right, you turn it in, it's in the paper the next day. But I'm interviewing Rosa Parks, right? One of my idols. So, I wanted her to know what a privilege it was for me to be there, but also I wanted the reader to kind of, if they could, understand a little bit about what it was to be me in a room with her. Obviously, it wasn't a feature, it wasn't a magazine piece, but just with little details about her and what have you, to give the reader a sense that it wasn't just anybody in the room interviewing her, that there was someone who actually felt connected to her struggle and her fight. But that's hard to do, right? As a younger journalist, where you're trying to make an impression and keep your job and build your resume. I feel a lot more at liberty to do that now, while doing all the reporting and the research and reading that's required of these pieces.
Well, you're kind of almost anticipating my next question, which really has to do with, again, I'm talking about your beat. Um, and there's so many different angles to it. You went from being Seattle based and writing for, essentially, I would hope this is correct, a local paper, to the LA Times, which is not really a regional paper, which is a national tribune, tribunal, a national paper, like Washington Post or the New York Times, which really speak to the whole country in a great sense. So those are different kinds of beats in the sense of the scope and the audience, the readership. Maybe we don't use that word anymore now that we're all digital and virtual. What are, right?
Yeah.
But who defines what you are able to write now? I mean, are you the force behind these stories? And I feel that in the work that I've read, which I hope.
Mhm. You've paused. Are you there?
We lose Magda. So
Uh,
are you there, Gabby?
Maybe it's a little stormy there.
There.
No, but somehow the connection just dropped. But I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're back.
Yeah. So as you know, the question really had to do with the presence of the beholder, the writer, the
Yeah.
journalist, and the certainly empathy that you bring to your stories. I think it's really important.
Well, I'll say, these stories are, they're all collaborative efforts, right? I mean, I have to, of course, make a pitch and get approval from my boss. I cover the presidential campaign, right? So it's the campaign 2020 team at the LA Times. And they're all excellent journalists, and they all have their kind of, I believe, their sort of specialties or things that they like to do. For me, I'm a magazine writer.
Mm.
And, I'm not a politics writer. I've never covered a campaign in my life. So I think my editor, and God bless her, took a chance on me that I'd be good in the mix with this team to sort of help peel back the layers as we cover the campaign, but also to understand a little bit better what America is, what it's going through, what its different dynamics are, where the fissures are, and where there are possibilities for building bridges. So it's kind of a social beat in a way that's built into the campaign coverage, and I just ate that up. I mean, I raved about that idea in my cover letter, and they seemed to be impressed with that. But you know, I I don't think of myself as a specialist really. I'm a general assignment reporter really, but I think what's happening in the United States right now fits perfectly with what I've been doing for my entire life, which is trying to understand America and trying to understand my place in it and trying to understand the place of those who I write about in this country as it changes. And that to me is a kind of beat that doesn't have, but it's not a category of journalism. It's something that I try to design, within my job. And I did the same thing at the Seattle Times, even though technically I was staff reporter for the Sunday magazine, but I wrote a lot of stories like that even then. So it's a beat that I've sort of crafted because it's a love of mine. And I've been fortunate enough to have editors who've allowed me to sort of run with that idea. But to me, America is a story that never ends. I mean, it never goes out of style. It always has legs.
Yeah.
Um, it's still a story even after you meet your deadline and the story's published. It's always a story, and I think that's what excites me about it. There's a million ways to get at that topic. It seems so simple, right? But America is a very complicated place, and I think we are seeing that in the last few months.
Well, this is fascinating. I'm going to sort of paraphrase back what I think you've just said because it's wonderful and it's fascinating at the same time because it sort of takes the notion of a beat, which is usually, you're doing the police blotter or you're doing social things or you're doing sports. Those are traditional beats, right? Or you're covering a certain neighborhood,
Yeah,
community, and it's almost like you have created a beat that is so your own and it moves with you. Does that make
yeah,
sense? It's
yeah. It
kind of
does.
your whole philosophy and
It goes with
identity.
me. And I think that, this is something that I know maybe not every journalist agrees with this, but, with writing with this kind of purpose and sense of mission, but, I don't think of it as I shouldn't say it's a mission. I mean, understanding the country, I think is essential to writing any story,
Hmm.
actually, of national scope, right? So for me, writing these pieces, whether it's about homelessness or about reparations, those are topics that are always of interest, I think. And while I might pursue them with a little bit more um, intentionality, I still think that's legit, as journalism, because all the reporting is there, and the same that all my colleagues do, and they do stories like this too, by the way. But for me, it's a passion, right? And I think that's the part that I don't want to hide. And so it moves with me in the sense that it's a part of what I think journalists ought to be doing. Especially those who are operating at the sort of national level. But again, even at the local level, there's plenty of opportunities to peel back the layers of the society and understand it better outside of the hard breaking news that goes in the paper the next day or the day after. I mean, I do stories like that, of course, but I think what I do well is hanging out with the community for a little while and understanding it at a level that maybe some journalists don't think to ask because of
Well,
the daily grind.
you have certain natural ins with certain communities, right? I mean,
Yeah,
you go to and to do a story on parts of the African American
yeah,
community. Say your recent piece on the elders, which I
yeah.
was able to read and which is so beautiful. Um, I don't think a non African American journalist
Mhm.
could produce that. Just
Yeah,
couldn't happen, and might not either have seen the story that was
yeah.
there to be written.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing. And again, this is not just me. I won't take credit for that for that sort of perspective. That's why there should be more of us in newspapers and on TV and in digital media and on radio. I mean, the idea that I have a set of eyes, or I have a lens through which I view the world that's very different from that of a white person or someone who's Asian American or whatever, or as a gay man, you know, I mean, I have different lenses actually. Someone who grew up in poverty, someone who grew up in a rural area, as opposed to in red state America. I mean, freaking Kentucky. So, I mean, I have all those lenses that might make my the story meeting interesting, and let alone the stories at the end of the day. So I think that's really important. But and I want more people like me to be able to participate in those conversations because they have lenses that are very key to understanding the country more deeply as well. But I try, and again, I try not to hide that. I mean, you know, in story meetings with my editor, I put my blackness right there on the table and I talk about that and all the experiences that that entails, you know, because if I don't do that, then who is going to do that? And I think one of the things that maybe hurts our credibility as journalists is that we often pretend to give one kind of version of history or one version of reality. And what I've learned in my life and what I've learned in my career is that we're each American in our own way, you know, and we live in this country in our own way, and we own that, and we're proud of that, and we want to share it. The question is, do news outlets want to hear it? And so this is a conversation I've had with journalists for several years now, and we continue to have at the LA Times, is how best to cover these communities and what do we bring of ourselves to the story conception phase, as well as the reporting and writing or picture taking or editing or whatever it happens to be at the end. That's a really important question, and we're being challenged on that with the recent protests and with the coverage of the coronavirus. You know, to sort of reach a little bit higher in how we think about what is news and what's worth covering and
Well,
how to do it.
I mean, the news that's unfolding now is also the news that you are telling. I mean,
Yeah,
so, and that's always been the case. It just seems like certain things have become so much more acute
yeah,
and urgent. Um,
yeah, and that's true.
and
And I if you don't mind, I'd love to pick up on that because uh, there is a, a heightened sense of urgency about covering the Black experience, the Black condition, police brutality, income inequality, or whatever it is. But I remember saying this the other day to somebody, I don't remember who it was, but those things have always been urgent for Black people. I mean, it's never not urgent, right? It's just who wants to hear the story? Does it take, you know, George Floyd's killing for people to care about police brutality and all the things that go into the criminal justice system? Why does it take that long? What could we do as journalists to make sure that those stories are still on the table, even when there's not an emergency or a crisis tearing the country apart? I think that's really important, right? I mean, for African Americans, these issues are always sort of at the emergency level, but it's often hard to get the ear of people like me in mainstream institutions that cover, you know, that call themselves the media.
you're right. And I think, one of the things that maybe it's possible to see now, at least a glimpse, it will surely be clearer in hindsight. We don't have the luxury of that yet. Um, will be the ways that um, all of this convergence probably. Um, it's just there's not. I don't think there's ever been a moment of such heightened uh, fear, among other things,
Yeah,
and awareness. Both. I mean, um, I'm not saying anything unique by saying that the pandemic has like ripped off the veil over American society
yeah,
for those who are not the Black population, who of course were living in a sense of urgency all along. But I refer to another piece of yours that I read about just a sort of collection, almost a hodgepodge of white people, I think, that you interviewed, right?
yeah,
Or one would say from all walks of life, a
yeah.
representative selection, whatever, of people who are saying, yeah, wow. I mean, it hadn't hit me like this before. And it's horrible to think that it took, we only know about because there was a video of it. But I mean, this is going to be part of the story of this time, the
Yeah,
past
yeah,
convulsive months that we've all
yeah.
lived through.
Absolutely. I think this is going to be a part of the conversation moving forward. You know, I have my, you know, my view of that is I've got to be patient with people. And if this is the first time that they've had a chance to really feel what a person of color feels when they watch a video of a person of color being killed by a police officer. Um, I got to accept that, and then hopefully ask questions. And what I try to do with that story about what white people are going through right now, their own reckoning, is try to get at where they go with it from there. Do they take action in their own communities? Does it change the way they think about the entirety of the African American community, so that it's not just an individualized outrage, but they understand that that a lot of African Americans deal with this outrage. You know, do they think about the color of their own skin differently because they saw a Black person treated this way by someone more like them? So those conversations were really interesting. I mean, obviously, I'm doing a lot of my reporting right here in my living room, so I wasn't able to look in someone's eyes necessarily and get the kind of intimate detail of the physical detail. But those conversations were incredibly confessional, because what I feel is that a lot of white people are maybe late, but waking up to the reality that there's another way to be an American again, and all the privilege that they enjoy becomes evident to them in the most painful of ways, because they see that Black people don't actually get treated that way by the cops. And I think that those conversations were very hard for me because I'm impatient. I, I don't think it should take a police killing for white people to understand what it's like to be Black. But be that as it may, where do we go from there? And so and people worked with me. The white people I interviewed worked with me. We built a level of trust, and I talked about my own experiences. I put my own outrage on the line and said, look, it's kind of weird for me to talk to you about this, because police brutality has been an issue for us for generations. But people apologize. People, one woman, I mean, she was kind of in tears. The woman in the piece, Lisa, who lives in Northern California, she said this amazing thing. She said, it's really hard to accept that you're a part of the problem when you've spent your entire life trying not to be. She thought she was a good Democrat, a good progressive, fighting the good fight. And even she had to realize that the country hadn't made as much progress when it came to justice for African Americans as she had imagined or had allowed herself to believe. And I think a lot of white people allow themselves to believe that the country is fairer than it is. And when they see this video for almost 9 minutes of a Black man being killed, calling out for his mama, I mean, and what I said in those interviews, and I'll just say, this is kind of my own confession, I see myself doing that. I mean, I see myself in George Floyd's that image of him, and that's, I don't consider that a reporting trick. That was me trying to build trust with the source, because I need for them to talk to me about this subject in the same way. But it was a very authentic moment, and I didn't plan it, but I think that as an African American journalist, I really am going to have to put myself on the line sometimes in order to build that kind of, create the kind of back and forth, because that's what I think the news is. The country is still majority white, I mean, for the time being, getting ever less so. But what do white people do with this video? What did they do with these protests? That to me is a huge story, because they still represent the power structure of the country, political, economic, social, otherwise. They're the gatekeepers for a lot of the Black experience. I mean, and I think whether I like that or not, and so I need to understand how this not just shifts their hearts, but how it shifts them in everything that they do in their lives. And so that piece, you'll read that people were doing things like holding their own rallies and thinking about how to teach their kids anti-racism, but how do they carry this moment forward so that it actually means something more? But it took a little bit to kind of get that rapport going, because I don't think white people give themselves a chance to think about themselves as a color, the way Black people and Latinos and Asian Americans and Native Americans always are. I mean, we kind of walk out of the house every day being that thing. And white people are just now, I think, understanding that in a way that I think is really meaningful.
Well, white is the default culture in a way, but it's that notion is supported by all those layers of privilege.
All of it, and I think it is quite painful for a white person to think, someone who thinks that they're a perfectly fine person, love their family, do great at their jobs, and that they're not racist, to come to the realization with the almost literal visual metaphor of a white man kneeling on a Black man, that their world is built on top of somebody else's, that their country is built on top of someone else's land. I mean, that to me, it must be earth shattering actually, but I mean, I'm not white, I'm assuming that it is, but what I'm getting from the white people I've talked to is that it really shook them. It wasn't just the killing, it was this whole sense that their entire world
Yes,
is represented by the guy
that's right.
doing the kneeling, even if they would never do that to a black person. You know what I mean? I think that's something that's really hard for white people to grapple with. But you know, as a black journalist, I want to understand that.
Well, again, I feel like you're from story to story, what you're doing is you're creating almost a path that,
Yeah,
I mean, if you didn't write that story, then the next story wouldn't have that depth, and it creates a place for people to go to deepen their understanding and keep on. It's very painful to stay in a state of pain too.
yeah,
And you
yeah,
could theoretically just say, well, that was a horrible, horrible incident. And it's tragic what happened to that man. And you could move away from that.
right.
But we're in a moment that has kindled, it has taken on a life of its own. And so, um, I'm thinking about you leaving Seattle, going to LA, thinking that you're going to be now covering this huge national conversation. Of course, we're talking about the age of the President of the United States, whose name I don't really like to say, even in private, so I won't say it now, but everyone knows who I'm talking about, who's in the White House, presumably right now, if he's not playing golf. And so you had one vision of what this job might be, and I'm curious to what extent has the pandemic sidelined what you hoped to do or changed it, and in what ways?
Well, you know, as I alluded to earlier, you know, I applied for this job, or you know, I wrote in my cover letter that I believe America is going through an identity crisis. So this would have been, what did I write that in winter of 2019, right? So before any of this happened.
Yeah.
But I already had an inkling that this campaign was going to be worth covering, not because of the fundraising and the polling and all this, you know, which of course I do enthusiastically, but because it was going to be a story about society itself and what America is and what it isn't, who's in and who's out. That's what makes Donald Trump who he is. He's really clear about who's in and who's out, who's fired, who's not. I mean, his whole life is like that, right? So I thought that this would be an election worth covering because that would spread around the country. Americans would start to grapple with what this country is, how it's changing, who belongs, who doesn't, and they were either going to expand that definition or it was going to get narrower. And I think those are the forces at play. And Trump, you know, is very good at showing us a narrower vision of that of the country and saying that this is what America is, and he wants to take America back to it. Other people say that America is a lot of other things that aren't included in that, and that's the kind of battle that we have here. It's a political battle outside of candidates running against each other, and I thought that would be really fascinating. So
Yeah.
I was so excited to come in and to dive into that. I had an inkling that that would be the case. I had no idea we would have a pandemic and the greatest protest movement in American history to bear that out. And I didn't know that America was going to have to simultaneously search its soul about how government responds to crisis, meaning the public health one, and search its soul to figure out how America becomes more just because of police brutality and inequality just at the same time. I mean, I just never imagined that it would be so overwhelming and that the story would kind of blow up in a way that, really had everyone in America, in all 50 states, in one way or another, grappling with these issues.
So, the storytelling, to some degree, in some of your pieces anyway that I've seen, has actually taken you to covering a medical emergency, a public
Mhm,
health emergency. You've brought that into some of
mhm.
your pieces that I've seen.
Yeah.
How do you do that when you don't have even a background in public health? I mean, is that
Yeah, how do you do that when you don't want to leave the house? I reported
yeah?
the story on Detroit and the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on the African American community of Detroit from home. So what I decided to do is, since I couldn't get on a plane and go to Detroit, and I didn't feel it was safe personally. I mean, I am Black. I am part of this sort of, threatened population, right? and this is back in the heat of the high point of the epidemic. So what I did was I found a person in Detroit, Marsha Music, who has a great name, who is a Detroit native, and you know, she's a homegirl. She grew up in Detroit's Black community, and her dad owned a record shop back in the day where Aretha Franklin cut her first gospel albums, and so I used her institutional knowledge of Detroit to talk about how a public health crisis tears through the social life of the city, how it threatens the heritage of the city, the connectivity between generations. So for me, taking a story about a health crisis is risky because I don't cover science and public health every day.
Exactly. That's
But
the
what I recognized right away, and what statistics were starting to show, was that African Americans and Latinos were being hit by this harder than other populations because of all these sort of endemic problems that come with being a person of color in this country. For African Americans, high blood pressure and hypertension and diabetes and predilection for asthma and other areas, living close to toxic sites, all the things that put African Americans at risk health-wise contributed to this disproportionality. And there's probably other reasons as well, but that was becoming clear at the time. So I didn't want to write about that because everyone else was writing about that already. What I wanted to understand was how you take that, the Black condition, and show how it can be eroded by a pandemic that at that point was sort of spiraling out of control. And at a time when the government wasn't really doing a great job of responding to it. I mean, this is a period when, you know, there were body bags piled up in hospitals in Detroit, when whole families were being hit by this virus. When you read that piece, I mean, you'll see that there's one family. It's like an elder in the Black community, and two of her sisters died all within 10 days, a husband and a wife. And so Marsha Music, when I started speaking with her, said she knew about 20 or knew of about 20 people in Detroit who had succumbed to the virus. And by the time I finished that reporting a few weeks later, it had gone up to over 30. So as I'm interviewing her and sort of writing my story, more people are dying, and the list of people that she knows grows. So it's like getting to know this person who's bearing witness from her own living room as I interview her in mine. And I'm using her Facebook posts, her tributes to the dead, to kind of weave a narrative of a slow rolling catastrophe moving through the Black community of Detroit, one of America's most vibrant African American cities, by the way, Motown and everything. I mean, so this is a city that's very important and symbolic for African Americans, and all of that was at risk because of this virus. So I turned it into a story about the Black condition, and really it was the story of Black people in Detroit and how a virus can sort of bring it to a halt. And that's what I wanted to get from Marsha. And I wanted the reader to understand also that although Marsha was not directly related to anyone who died at that point, their deaths were, you know, reverberated in her as if they were the next of kin. And African Americans are so used to grieving for each other across the street, across town, across the country. And now we've got this damn thing that's taking thousands of us in a matter of days. And we've got to grieve for all of them at the same time without leaving our homes, without being able to go to a funeral, to a wake or a funeral, or do visitation at the hospital. All of that was off limits because of COVID-19. So imagine that, a population that is, as one minister told me, is used to grieving. Black people are used to loss. um, Everything, right? Our identities. But this is even too much for us. And I thought I wanted Americans to see that. I wanted other Americans to see what it was like for African Americans to grieve in this way and to suffer loss, because I'm not so sure they understood that. And again, I didn't realize that a few months, weeks almost later, George Floyd would teach America that in a very different way when it came to police brutality, which is another public health crisis, by the way. And that trauma, the mental trauma of these videos, and the mental trauma of these poor healthcare outcomes, Black people live with that every day. It's always an emergency. It's just that nobody wants to listen unless it's in the news. But this was not a news story, the one that I wrote about Detroit and COVID-19, actually. It was a story about what goes on inside of one woman as she grieves for a whole city. for a whole community, and as the rest of Black America grieves with cities like Detroit.
You're saying so many very, very suggestive things all at once, and I have more questions.
Sorry.
But before I, hug the airspace, I just want to remind people watching that we are going to open up for questions, um, sooner rather than later. And we encourage you, if you have things on your mind or comments that Tyrone has made you'd like to respond to, please enter them in the chat that's a part of this live stream. So I read that piece too. I couldn't read all your pieces because of the LA Times firewall or paywall or whatever one calls it, but that was a remarkable piece. And what you're saying reminds me to remind people watching that Tyrone Beason is doing all of this work, as of course you're not the only one, his colleagues are too. People are working from home. And so um, all the bells and whistles of contemporary journalism, in a way, are not available to you, or some of them not. And I'm wondering whether a piece like the one you just described with Martha Music, would you have thought of doing it if you had been able to jump on a plane and go to Detroit? Maybe you would have, but in any case, the question is more like, did it cause you to use different resources? And if so, what were they? And if so, also, you mentioned using the Facebook post,
Yeah.
to really make the grief visible.
Mhm.
Do you think that the piece changed because of the way you had to cover it?
I think so. It might have been a little bit. There might have been a video, more portraits of her, and what have you. But I mean, it was still a dangerous situation. Even if I were able to go to Detroit, I wouldn't have been able to roam around Detroit in the way in a safe way. I think it was too dangerous to do that. But the limitation, actually, being able to, not being able to really see her, but to talk to her and hear the pain in her voice, and not just pain. What was interesting about that, and you'll kind of see this in the piece and in her in the Facebook post that I excerpted and and literally put into the story and quoted, is there's pain, there's joy, there's nostalgia, there's um, anger, there's regret, there's a kind of questioning. A lot of her posts, she keeps saying she's blessed to have survived the virus, and because God spared her, and she doesn't know why, because she's no more special than any other African American person in this country. But why? And what should she do now that she's survived? And so she decided to bear witness, and to pay tribute in her Facebook feed. So her Facebook feed became the life of that story, along with the live quotes that I got from her on the phone. But a lot of what you see is actually what she wrote the day she learned of a new death, and and remembering that person or that couple or that family, not just saying rest in peace, but giving little snippets of what it was like when the last time she saw that person, or and I thought that was really, it was very beautiful. One of the people that she knew of from around the way was a longtime love and confidant of Aretha Franklin, actually, who passed away because of COVID-19. But she didn't write about that. She wrote about the fact that she saw this man when she was a little girl. He was a fireman, so he was a fixture in sort of her world when she was a little girl. And so what I thought was really profound was that she was painting a picture of Detroit over time as well. She wasn't just telling us she was sorry about people who had died. She's talking about how suddenly fixtures in the community, people you always saw there, were gone. So these disappearances, in a way, were what really made that story special. As far as I'm concerned, you just look out from your living room window because you're afraid to go outside, but you sense that Detroit, when you go back out, won't have these landmarks, these people who made the city what it was. Cities are not just buildings and streets; they're people. And so that was what was profound. That I thought that, and it's something that I thought that everyone who read the story could identify with, even if they were not African American, even if they knew nothing about Detroit. Everybody knows what it's like when you come back home and you don't see that the house that used to be down on the block, or the person sitting out on the front porch, or the person at the bar that always telling stories. When those people leave, then the city really does feel like it's lost. And I think that's something that I thought would be the sort of the universal quality of the story that would allow anyone to read it and get something from it. And that I could do with her posts, that I was limited in a way, but also it opened up this amazing possibility for creating what felt like a diary of her grief over time.
Well, it's remarkable what you've been creating. I'm uh, challenged by it, and it makes me wonder because you're the one carrying this burden. How heavy is it, Tyrone, to be you, to be doing what you're doing? Is there a sense of just like, whoa, let me not have to do this every day, wake up and be thinking all of this? Could some of you, other, like, could you white people do this? Or
Mhm,
is there a way in which it is so much part of
mhm.
who you are now as a
Yeah.
journalist that it has um, some silver lining, perhaps?
I have to get back on this on the silver lining part, but I think that
You're
you know,
retired. There may not
I
be
don't want to
one.
sound, yeah, I don't want to sound selfish here, but I'll say this, uh, Black journalists and journalists of color, gay journalists, women journalists, whoever you are going out into a world that's not like your own, you carry this burden. It's not just me. And I talked about this with, with colleagues from different backgrounds. But if you are not there telling these stories, who is going to do it? And so I'm always left at the end of the day, no matter how exasperated I might feel, or how sleepless my nights might be sometimes doing this work, because I feel this pain too. I grieved for days and days and days writing about martial music in Detroit. And I grieve along with her today for all the people who died. It was personal for me. I am Black. These people are my people who I'm writing about. And yet the byline may not tell the reader that. The story may not convey that, but I'm carrying all of that inside of me too. That's hard. It's exhausting. But if I am not doing that, if I'm not bringing this perspective to the work and to the LA Times audience, then I'm doing a disservice, I think, to journalism and myself and our readers. And so it's one of those things where, yeah, I guess I can feel sorry for myself, but somebody's going to have to do this, and we're all going to have to sort of, step up and be a part of this incredibly profound moment in America's history. I get exhausted reading Trump's quotes. I mean, I cover the election. I mean, it's my job to do this, right? To sort of cover the candidates. But my goodness, it's every day. So my story that's in the paper today actually is
Mm.
about Donald Trump and how he is singularly crude in how he talks about race and what is included and what is not and what is an American really, with him going off on protesters. But you know, in a way, he's going off on me. I mean, the way he talks about the Black community and Black discontent is problematic. So what do I do with that, right? I'm a journalist, so I wrote a piece about how as singular as he seems, he's part of a long tradition of candidates and presidents who've used race to divide Americans, and to more than divide Americans, to make white people feel like they are threatened by everybody else. And he literally, and I want to read this to you today, and because I think it's very important. The day after my story runs, he does exactly what I'm talking about. I wish I could have put it in the piece. He is trying to make suburban white women afraid of low income and people of color moving into the suburbs. And he's doing it in such an elementary way, but I think it kind of gets at what the country, what this campaign is going to be about. And he basically says, I'm happy to inform all the people living in their suburban lifestyle dream that you will no longer be bothered or financially hurt by having low income housing built in your neighborhood. And so my story yesterday was about how that
Mm.
kind of signaling is not Donald Trump's. Politicians have been doing that for decades, trying to make it seem as if the majority is at risk by the minority. Now, of course, Trump is doing this knowing that the minority in not too many decades is going to be the majority. And that must stir some anxiety in white people
He
who
won't be
have the
here.
American dream set. And
Yeah.
so he's saying that we are going to take your American dream. And that might sound silly, but it actually is quite effective, as a way to show the candidate, to show the voter that there's a choice here and there's a choice there. There's an America here and there's an America there. Which one do you want? I'm looking out for yours. And so this kind of thing is frustrating for me. But what I try to do is to take that, what I know to be a historical truth about how politicians use race, and turn it into a piece of journalism with scholars quoted and examples of Trump's language, also examples from, say, Woodrow Wilson and George Wallace, the segregation now and forever. I mean, to show that he is part of a tradition of politicians who, when the chips are down and when it seems like they're not going to get all the white people they need to vote for them, will use the rest of America as a kind of scapegoat for what some white people feel threatens their American dream. Again, I don't know how effective it's going to be this time around, but he's totally going there.
Oh boy. Well, we are almost out of time, and I guess anyone who's hung in with us or even just recently tuned in, you can tell that I could talk to Tyrone Beason for hours. But as a more or less final question from my side, I'm just curious. What do you feel are the biggest challenges ahead? I mean, we are, looking at November as the election.
Mhm.
That's a short-term horizon, but it's a scary one. And over maybe even through that and beyond it, what do
Mhm.
you define as your own challenges as a journalist at this point? Seems like you can do anything you want.
I think the country is going to continue to move through this cycle well beyond the election. I think the election is a part of a I don't know if it's a hysteria or if it's a kind of breaking down of old notions about what the country is, but I think Trump is a part of that. I think Barack Obama is a part of that. I think September 11th is a part of that. This country has been faced over the past couple of decades with numerous instances that have challenged what America is. I think a lot of us um, maybe celebrated at the sight of an African American president for the first time in America's history. Not everybody celebrated.
Hmm.
A lot of us celebrated when Donald Trump essentially avenged his version of America by becoming president. Um, I don't think everybody believes in defunding the police as much as that is a part of our conversation right now. So I think these things are going to keep moving even after the election. And whoever wins in November is going to have to face his country, because apparently it's going to be a man, uh, who goes, the two men who are heading toward November, is going to have to face a country that is in a deep period of questioning about what this country is, what it can do, who belongs, who doesn't. How can we make more people fit in? I don't know. How can we kick more people out, whether it's building of walls or whatever? I mean, that is going to keep those conversations are going to keep going well after the election. So we all have to be geared up, I think, as journalists to follow that story, even though the hot news of the election has passed.
Got you. Well, Tyrone, this has been an incredible conversation. I think that what I see when I look through my own crystal ball here in Tepoztlan, Mexico, is that you should write a book. I really do. I think it'll be an amazing, amazing book. We have to
Thank you.
close out now, I'm afraid. And from what I'm understanding, we don't have questions from the audience. I hope that's not because I asked too many of my own. But I would like to remind people that Under the Volcano is taking applications for 2021 master classes in fiction, poetry, literary nonfiction, which includes memoir, and an incredible investigative journalism masterclass, which will, in many ways, hone in on some of these issues, particularly through the lens of science and looking at some of the ways that journalism, as practiced by Tyrone, really exemplified by Tyrone, can turn its mind towards solutions, towards leading a conversation that goes on and on. So I would encourage people who are interested to apply or to tell people they know to apply, and also to remind you that we are taking donations to support our scholarship fund. And in particular, we have a new fund, which is the Black Writers Matter Fund, that is going to provide partial or full financial support as needed, and also mentoring. And I may as well say this for one lucky Black journalist, their mentor will be Tyrone Beason. So I can't thank you enough for being with us. We'll get this conversation up on video so it will live
Great,
online, and we'll try to create some kind of a textual transcript of it too.
great. Well, it's my
Thank you
pleasure.
so
Thank you
much
so
for
much.
taking the time to share all this with us. It's been
That's my
really,
pleasure.
really great. Good night, everybody, or late afternoon if you're on the West Coast, or good morning if you're in Australia. We're signing off.
Bye bye, everybody.
Thank you again. Go to our website. Bye bye.
Bye bye.